In this video, I'm going to talk about the chart of Neil Peart, who was the drummer of the rock band Rush. He recently passed away. Suddenly, the world found out. It was very sad news to musicians, music lovers, myself personally. And I wanted to do a case study on his chart. So for those who like the band Rush and who like astrology, you'll definitely like this. I'm going to start in the first part of the video just talking about Neil Peart. And then, so for those of you who just like Rush, you'll also get something out of that. I am going to be looking at his chart as well and using the chart factors to explain his nature. And then later in the video, I'm going to get a little bit more technical. I think people that like Neil Peart and like music, but maybe don't understand astrology so well, will still get something out of it, but you might not. So I'm going to keep the personal praise and accolades in the first part and explain his nature based on the astrology, and then do some more detailed work later on as I'm going to attempt a rectification, because we don't really have his birth time. We do have a good birth date. As you can see here, we have a good birth date, but we don't have a good time. So first, I want to talk a little bit about Neil Peart and the band Rush. They were a rock band from the 70s. There were many great rock bands from the 70s. Rush was unique in that they had a very unique and eclectic style of music that was very, what was called progressive rock music at the time. Progressive then went on to mean a whole bunch of different things. But in the 70s, mid-late 70s, you had progressive rock. They called it prog rock as well. And it originally started with bands like Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Yes, Genesis, Rush got in that vein. Led Zeppelin certainly had progressive rock moments. And then even like King Crimson, other bands like this. Rush was unique in that they came sort of at the end as that type of music was already somewhat established. Rush then came in the mid-late 70s with their own really unique sound that was full of high-energy rock styling and hard rock sort of sensibility, but with very bold lyrics that were very unique. The instrumentation was very technical. They were all three very good players. It was only three of them. Neil Peart was the drummer. Then also the bass player is named Geddy Lee, and the guitar player was named Alex Lifeson. I've actually personally met two of them. I met the bass player Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson, the guitar player. I never met Neil Peart, the drummer, before. He was much more of a private man. But their music was just amazing, especially for those who really got Rush. They had a mixture of sound that was very unique because, first of all, Neil Peart's lyrics, the drummer, who was incredibly technical, certainly renowned as probably the best technical rock and roll drummer ever. It's not even a stretch to say that. He's pretty much been recognized as such, as well as Geddy Lee, the bass player, as like probably the best rock bassist ever. You had the best bass player and the best drummer in the same band. The guitar player, Alex Lifeson, was probably very underrated as far as guitar players go, just because there's so many guitar heroes, but also just fantastic. They were three incredibly good musicians, which is one thing, but they were also incredibly good songwriters for that genre. Wrote incredibly emotional and impactful and energetic songs and music. And at the heart of that music was Neil Peart, the drummer's lyrics. He wrote the words to their songs. So again, it was very unique. He was an incredibly technical drummer, but also a very literate, lyricist. His song lyrics were little masterpieces. Certainly could stand alone as poetry. And they represented a whole myriad of subjects from, like one of his famous songs. I say famous. It's an easy one to explain lyrically because it draws a very simple parable to trees, and it used the parable of trees and compared them to like ERA, like women's rights. There's a line that says, the trouble with the maples, and they're quite convinced they're right. They say the oaks are just too lofty and they grab up all the light, but the oaks can't help their feelings if they like the way they're made, and they wonder why the maples can't be happy in their shade. And then he says, there is trouble in the forest and the creatures all have fled as the maples scream oppression and the oaks just shake their head. And then the last verse, it says, so the maples formed a union and demanded equal rights. The oaks are just too greedy. We will make them give us light. Now there's no more oak oppression, for they passed a noble law. And the trees are all kept equal by hatchet, axe, and saw. For example, right? And, to be honest with you, Neil Peart died about 10 days ago, 10, 15 days. It was a couple weeks ago now, we found out maybe. And I've delayed doing this because I couldn't do it because I was getting emotional. I'm starting to get a little emotional now. I'm not going to lose it, but I was losing it before, thinking about it, because it's very sad. He died suddenly of brain cancer. Actually, he had the brain cancer, the glioblastoma, for about 3 years, and no one knew it. And it was announced all of a sudden that he had died. And the thing that makes it sad is Neil Peart also met with great tragedy. In 1997 and 1998, his daughter was suddenly killed in a car accident, and then less than a year later, his wife died of cancer. He was just going along, and his daughter is killed in a car accident. Then his wife dies of cancer. And at that time, the band Rush, they stopped totally. They were just kind of shut down because they didn't know, their friend, their drummer friend, he was just dealing with that. They weren't sure the band would ever continue again. Then they did come back, and they came back more popular than ever, more powerful than ever. Their last several albums were really well received. They toured. They did their last farewell tour in 2015. They finished in the middle of 2015, and a few months later, that's when Neil Peart found out that he had the brain tumor. And it's so sad because he had just gotten remarried again, and he had a 9-year-old daughter. When at the time he died, he left his 9-year-old daughter. And it's just very sad because he just wanted to raise his daughter. When they stopped touring, she was about 6 years old. And then he found out he had cancer, and he wasn't going to get to raise his daughter. This is what makes it very sad. For as great a musician he was, all of us who are fans of the band, it's hard to take. It really hurts. It's like a gut punch, And also because the guys in the band Rush itself meant so much to the fans that liked them because they were so unique. There is no other band. Rush is like its own category because their music was so different. It was so unique. They were so independent. They were so fiercely creative. They never sold out to be popular. Their songs were in odd key signatures, time signatures. They went through all these different changes. But underneath it all, they were just very normal guys. They were very nice guys, very normal guys. They were together for 40 years. And they were friends. They were good friends with each other. And they had a relationship with their fans that was almost like no other band. Maybe the only thing I can compare it to is the Grateful Dead. This has been a comparison because the same kind of fanaticism that people feel for the Grateful Dead, they feel for Rush. And because of, the loyalty, because the band was so unique and the songs were so powerful and at such a high quality, they really cared. This is the thing that you can see. They cared to work everything out. They weren't just jamming. They weren't just up there like, let's get high and kind of make a record and make a lot of money and be celebrities. None of that was part of the band. They were serious about what they did. They weren't serious about themselves. They were very goofy as individuals. Again, they're just normal guys who were just incredible musicians and who took so much time and so much meticulous care with the music. And you can tell because everything is so worked out. Everything is so detailed, yet so spontaneous and so free and so high quality. You know, the measure of a good band is if you could play those songs, if you could play Rush songs. This is why a whole generation of musicians grew up loving Rush, myself included. Because if you could play those songs, then you were good. You know, it was very hard. You know, since Neil Peart died, there's been some funny memes going around the internet. One of them I saw, which was very funny, was something to the effect of somewhere Neil is looking down laughing at all the bands trying to find a simple Rush song to play as a tribute. Because now, you know, Neil Peart passes and now a band wants to play a Rush song to honor them. And it's like, we can't play any of them. Songs are too damn hard to play. So, you know, they were such a high quality band. And, you know, one of the things that really struck me, there's a great documentary that was called Beyond the Lighted Stage that was done 2014, maybe 2013. And just to see it, whether you're a fan of the band or not, I think you can get it on Hulu or Netflix or one of those, maybe both of them. Just to see interviews with artists, especially rock and roll musicians, who can be some of the most arrogant idiots, jerks that you could ever find. You know, and again, you forgive them because I don't really care, by the way, about that kind of stuff. You know, that most of those guys in bands are kind of, you know, coke heads and mistreating women and, you know, busting up hotels and drunks and all this stuff. We just kind of expect that's what they are. It's not the way Rush was. They were very normal, straight guys, just writing this amazing music. But in the documentary, you see all kinds of stuff. You see interviews with the three of them throughout the years and old archive footage. So if you're a fan of the band, you should definitely see it. So for example, there was an interview with Gene Simmons. And by the way, in the movie, they interview all these rock stars that loved Kiss. Like, musicians love Kiss. All these musicians that grew up, not Kiss, Rush. All these musicians grew up listening to Rush. So you see all these modern musicians talking about how Rush was their favorite band. But anyway, there's an interview with Gene Simmons from Kiss, because Kiss and Rush back in the mid-70s used to tour together a lot. And Kiss was one of these rock and roll bands that were always drunk and ripping up hotels and acting like lunatics. And it's like, those guys in Rush were so boring. Like, we'd be in hotels and there'd be chicks everywhere and, hey, let's party. And these guys just be back in their hotel rooms watching TV. We're like, what's wrong with you guys? These were young guys too. They were in their early 20s. All three of them got married really early. They all got married and had kids and families, even though they were working musicians and out on the road. They were very normal guys. They never got into the big celebrity trappings of being in a band. That's probably why they lasted 40 years as well. So it's a really great case study in how to be a good guy, you know, how to be just guys that you like. It's great when your heroes wind up being 10 times more heroic than you would have even imagined, because they didn't even have to do that. They could have just written that great music and been idiots, and then we'd have still loved them. But it turns out that they're all just really such great guys. And so Neil Peart's passing was really quite difficult, and it's still hard to bear a little bit. But now I'm going to talk about his astrology chart, especially for people who are really interested in astrology. It's going to be a case study as well, like a rectification. Now you can see here, I've done a bit of a rectification. Whether it's right or not, I'm not exactly sure, but I'm going to go with the Virgo ascendant seems to be pretty close. One of the things about, especially, it also lines up with the timing you can see of the dashas over here. But we'll show this. Is this right? What do we got? Yeah, that's right. Okay, so now we have, you could see in the chart here that we would have had Jupiter cycle starting like in 1960. Well, let's get to the dashas later. First, we have in his chart there's Saturn and Venus. They're in Virgo. Let's forget the ascendant first, but Saturn, Venus in Virgo. Neil Peart was quite serious. This is one of the reasons why I think that Rectification could make sense, because one of the things about Neil is he was very serious. And of the three guys in the band, he was not very comfortable with fame, with the public at all. And he was kind of like a hermit. Geddy and Alex, the guitar and bass player, would go out and do meets and greets, and they were very comfortable with the public, with interviews. And Neil wasn't. Neil was much more shy, much more reserved, much more, in a bad rap sense, standoffish, which I don't think he was standoffish at all. He was revered as like a god, and people coming up and gushing all over him, which happens all the time with those guys. He just wasn't comfortable with it. And he, so he really didn't do a lot with the public. He would be sort of behind the scenes. He'd come out and play, and then he'd sort of disappear. He did some interviews, like when there was something to talk about, but to just be available to fans and stuff, he was just quite shy in person. But he was wildly creative, and also a normal guy, like a sort of humble, normal, everyman sort of guy. That would really show with Saturn and Venus in Virgo. Venus is in the debilitated sign here in Virgo, and also with Saturn, it shows this kind of awkwardness around phony interactions. One of his famous lyrics, the one that's most often quoted, is, "I can't pretend a stranger is a long-awaited friend." In their song Limelight, living in the limelight, the universal dream for those who wish to see. Those who wish to be must put aside the alienation, get on with the fascination, the real relation, the underlying theme. And he was talking about, because they started to get famous, and, he wrote about that. And, the one line is, "I can't pretend a stranger is a long-awaited friend," because there were so many more demands on their time, and so many situations where he was expected to also be phony. So this Venus Saturn in Virgo, whether it's the first house or not, is very poignant with, very serious, but also seriously creative. And serious about your creativity and worrying over the creativity and crafting. This sort of craftsmanship is really shown here. He also has the sun in Leo. Again, very powerful sun in Leo, which shows the physical power and stamina and strength. Also with Mercury. The moon in Gemini. Again, all this Mercury energy. Venus, Saturn, and Mercury signs. Mercury is the communicator and the speaker. And he was not only the great writer and the great scribe, which is Virgo, but also moon in Gemini, very articulate, very well-spoken, wide vocabulary. And when you see him in interviews and stuff, like where he's actually participating, he's actually quite comfortable and very verbose, very funny and witty and everything else. The thing that he didn't like was just all of the false praise and all the stuff that comes from meeting people in these awkward social situations. But you can definitely see this moon in Gemini as well, where he was very curious about all kinds of things, extremely well read, extremely like a voracious curiosity, and a desire to speak it and to communicate it, and also very funny. Like some of the most beautiful parts of that movie was around the end, when you see them hanging out and having dinner and getting drunk and having fun together. You see how these three guys just really loved each other, which is what makes it quite sad to see that these guys that we care so much about, who made this great music, the ones that survive, are feeling bad for their friend. They must be just torn up over it. Well, let me tell you something though, and this is straight out of Jaimini's Upadesha Sutras, and this is something that is going to be good news for Neil Peart fans. And I'm going to say it, and it's very clear, and everybody who's ever looked at Jaimini's Upadesha Sutras or knows anything about the spiritual implications of the Navamsha chart knows that Ketu in Pisces in the Navamsha chart means the person gets liberation after death. It's right in Jaimini Sutras. Ketu in the 12th or Ketu in Pisces, and the soul takes liberation after death. He's in a better place. And yeah, he was a very high being. So you can see right there, Ketu in Pisces and in the Vamsha chart. So Neil, he was a high being, a very high being, and Ketu in Pisces and in the Vamsha, and the soul takes liberation after death. So we're here to remember, and he's in a better place. I wanted to say that before I forgot, but but you can see here this Venus, Saturn, and Virgo. Virgo is a very practical, methodical, organized sign. Now, again, the way he organized his lyrics, organized his thoughts, organized his drum solo. You hear him explain his drum solo, and he explains it like it's a piece of literature. He does. He explains his drum parts like it's a piece of literature. When you listen to our interviews of all three of them at any point, but Peart, you hear him talk about his drum parts, and he's like, all the little changes that he does, he works it out and organizes it like it's a piece of literature. Playing drums, it's like, where does this guy come with these? And you hear him play, and it's like, yeah, that's what he's doing. It's just it's crafted beyond belief. And again, their music and them as individuals were so loved and cared for because they loved and cared for their craft so much. They bothered to care. They bothered to do the work. They really cared enough to pour over lyrics, to work the music down to the last most perfect nugget of things being worked out and timed, and building to crescendos. One of the things I always loved about Rush's music is the way the song builds, particularly in the several albums that were my favorite. My favorite era of Rush was from like A Farewell to Kings to like Moving Pictures. Signals was a little weak, but then Grace Under Pressure. But really that sweet spot between Farewell to Kings, Hemispheres, Permanent Waves, Moving Pictures, All the World's a Stage, the live album. That epic from late 70s to like 1980, 81 was just the way they built the song, where it would start here and then the second verse is here and then the solo and then it culminates, was just like, it was so beautifully done. And I say this because they cared enough to work it out. All three of them, and Peart especially, when you talk about the lyrics, the way they're crafted, the drum parts, the way everything works was so meticulous and yet so free. It wasn't like they were robots. They played this music that was like a celebration. One of the things that Geddy Lee said when they were talking about that period of time when Neil Peart's wife died and daughter died, he said something that was so poignant. This is the bass player, Geddy Lee said, yeah, we were done. We couldn't even think about music. He said, I didn't pick up my guitar for a year or two. He said, I couldn't even really look at it or even really think about it because, our spirit was so crushed, and then he says something like, rock and roll music especially is like a celebration, and we didn't have anything to really celebrate. We were, our spirit was like it was crushed. Talking about, the band playing after Neil Peart's wife and daughter died. Again, and so they crafted music that was like a celebration and such detail that other bands just frankly don't do. And they don't have to. Other bands do what they do, but this is what Rush did. And if you got it and liked it, you were like, wow, I can't believe these guys. This is three guys doing this. So, Peart wrote the words. He wrote all those words that we sang. And again, and the words were incredible. No other band had lyrics like that. You're listening to other rock and roll. Sometimes Led Zeppelin approached it. One band that came pretty close was the Moody Blues. They also had some very intense lyrics about, the deeper mysteries in life. But most rock bands, Aerosmith sometimes got kind of close with some things, but nothing like what Rush did. They had entire stories that played out over 2 albums, bringing in mythology and just incredible concepts. So to continue with the chart, we see Mars in Scorpio. Now, a couple things here really powerful, and it also goes back to Virgo. I'm going to get into the rectification in a minute. But Mars in Scorpio, again, Scorpio is about depth, emotional depth, digging into the deeper mysteries of things. And again, this kind of detective-like mind. And the courage to explore it, the courage to explore these deeper themes. You know, Scorpio is also about regeneration and dealing with pain and taking deep pain and transforming it. Imagine Neil Peart, 1997, he was like 43 years old or something like that. And his daughter gets killed in an auto accident, and then less than a year later, his wife dies. His entire world is over. Like everything he lived for and he loved was taken away within a year. How tragic. And he came back. He had to run and do all these things, but he regenerated and rejuvenated and came back without bitterness or any of that stuff. Scorpio is a sign of being able to endure immense pain and difficulty and transform it into emotional strength. The alchemy of, and to take it and help others heal. From that place, he started doing a lot of travel diaries and travel logs. Neil Peart used to like to get on his motorcycle and ride all over the place and write and go into cafes and journal and write and, you know, just kind of, you know, muse and philosophize. And so he did a lot of writing and a lot of work helping people heal this kind of pain. He wrote a lot about that kind of stuff, of how to put those things into perspective and what helped him. And again, he was anything but arrogant or pretentious. He never pretended to know more than the next guy, even though he was so enlightened and literate and intelligent and wise. But so this Mars in Scorpio is also very poignant. And then Jupiter in Aries, again, this sort of courage. You know, they had a very famous song called Free Will, one of my favorite songs off the Permanent Waves album. Talk about building to a crescendo. Boy, that last verse when they come out of that guitar solo, that crazy guitar solo with the bass solo, and after all of that music, it reaches that crescendo where Geddy Lee comes out and it's each of us a cell, love awareness, imperfect and incomplete. You know, just the song builds to this point where it's so much power. But the song Free Will, very much about Jupiter in Aries. Aries is free will. You know, the chorus says, you can choose a ready guide in some celestial voice. If you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. You can choose from phantom fears and kindness that can kill. I will choose a path that's clear. I will choose free will. This is an example of one of their songs. That's the chorus, right? And, you know, singing this powerful music over these really thought-provoking lyrics when you're 15 years old is really inspiring to me. What my life was back then. I mean, this is the reason why so many of my era just loved Rush, because especially if you cared enough and you were thoughtful and you were, you know, trying to look deeper into things. There were no other rock bands that were saying that kind of stuff in their songs. Hard to overestimate how much those guys meant to people like me, trying to figure it out, trying to figure out life. You know, and Neil Peart's lyrics were a huge part of that. I saw an article, I think it was from the New York Times, where someone summed it up pretty well, and they said, you know, one of the central themes in Neil Peart's lyrics were that, you know, it's like it might be some heady subject, but you get the feeling that the person who is narrating it is just as confused as you are. They're also trying to make sense of it, but somehow they've been where you've been, and they're kind of reporting back to you that it's okay. It's okay that you don't know. I don't know either, but it's okay to sort of work through it and be and sort of marvel at the wonder of it all, which is so much of what they were doing. And that was just that's who they were. They were guys in their late 20s and then 30s, and later on. So I will tell you the reason that I mainly that I think I have a suspicion that it's Virgo or somewhere around here. This Venus Saturn in the first house again really shows a quality that is so prominent in Neil Peart. He looked like like a serious old man, even almost like an old grouch. And he could even come across that way, especially in later years. And he even kind of laughed at it. And people would kind of, even in the movie about Rush, I think it's Jack Black said, when you see Getty and Alex, they have this really friendly energy, like they just really love each other. And it's just real lighting, sort of goofy the way they act. He goes, and then the master Neil appears, and it's wisps of darkness enters the room. This brooding intensity, sort of this describing Neil Peart as this kind of brooding intensity, the master, the serious, professor. You can see that. And you can see that and this is very much Saturn in the first house, very serious, but at the same time, very polite. I've seen him in interviews. There's one interview that was done by a reporter after they started doing interviews again. And this person started pressing Neil about that period in his life when his daughter was killed and his wife died. And you could see not just Neil was uncomfortable, everyone was uncomfortable. And this reporter pressed it a couple times. You want to strangle the guy because you saw him press it a couple times, and you saw Neil try to deflect it with good manners, with Venus energy. He said it once, and then Neil said, well, on to happier subjects, and kind of went like, okay, I don't want to talk about this, on to happier subjects. And then the interviewer didn't get the hint, and he was like, yeah, but that must have been really hard, huh? And Neil does it again. He goes, as I said, on to happier subjects. And he's got this smile on his face, like you could tell he's really uncomfortable because he doesn't feel like talking, reliving the pain of his daughter getting killed and his wife dying. But you can see this Saturn Venus. Saturn, which is like putting up a barrier. One of the lines from Limelight is, one must put up barriers to keep oneself intact. Right? Living in the fish islands, caught in the camera eye. I have no heart to lie. I can't pretend a stranger is a long-awaited friend. So this Saturn Venus in the first house, especially in Virgo, which is also Virgo, it's very pure, it's very simple, it's very humble. He's a very humble man for being so intellectual, which is Virgo and Mercury energy. He's so humble, but yet so intellectual, very Virgo-like. You could look at him and just read his words and say, God, what a Virgo, detailed, worrying about every little detail. Total Virgo energy. Couple other things is this: if it's Virgo ascendant, this Saturn and Venus are both wicked Raja yogas. For those of you who study Vedic astrology, Raja yogas are royal yogas, king yogas that make someone a king. And this Saturn is the 5th lord in the first. Venus is the 9th lord in the first. It's really powerful Raja yogas here with the 2 Dharma planets. And when we look at the dashas, you could see somewhere around this time, this was when Rush really hit it big, when the Saturn dasha started. Saturn dasha started, and boom, this string of like 20 years of stuff happening. Okay, a few other things about this ascendant that I like is puts the moon in the 10th house, which is always which often shows fame, recognition, and public goodwill, where people in the public like you. He's very beloved by the public. And for all his foibles that some people might give, he's one of the most beloved. I mean, the accolades that have come since has surprised me. I didn't know that many people were so enamored with Rush from all walks of life. A couple other things that I'm going to get into, a few events with the dashas in a minute, but Mars in the third house, this powerful Mars, third house has to do with the hands, has to do with drums. And man, he beat the crap out of those drums. This is Mars in the third house in Scorpio in its own sign. This is like the power to beat the drums like that. I am not at all surprised to see Mars in the third house of, the stamina, the strength, the dexterity. By the way, Virgo is also very much about dexterity. All that Mercury energy is the skills to actually do it. And Mars in Scorpio gives the power. Anytime you get Mars in the third house, the person will often be very strong, especially strong arms, a lot of strength. And, those guys would do 3-hour shows in their 60s. Neil Peart back there banging on the drums, playing some of the most complicated material ever in his 60s. I mean, you can't even hardly play that stuff when you're in your 20s, let alone for 3 hours. It's incredible how these guys kept doing that in their 60s. I mean, again, it's just unbelievable what these guys did in their career. It's just amazing. So the other thing about the Virgo ascendant, it puts Rahu in the fifth house. Again, fifth house is very creative. It's literally the love of being creative. And Neil Peart was so creative, of course, with his drums, with his words, with his writing, with his books. Just always creative. So this is also there. A few other things. Again, we see the Venus. We especially see the Saturn in the first, which would show boundaries, but also the Lugna Lord Mercury and the Sun in the 12th house. 12th house is also like wanting to hide out. It's like the hermit. But again, it's how we hide out and when we're alone. But he's got the Sun in the 12th house and Leo in its own sign. So what he did when he was hanging out, when he was hiding out, when he was by himself, he wasn't really escaping. It wasn't escapism, like let me go escape into drugs and alcohol and escapism. No, he was escaping from the BS, from the phony BS into some true reality, some true creative place. He wanted to escape from all that crap. He's like, I don't want to deal with any of this stuff. You guys want to go out and meet the public and all. That's great. You guys like it. I don't. I'm just going to escape from all that stuff and be back here practicing, or, I'll meet you at the gig. I'll ride my motorcycle. I'll be by myself and ride my motorcycle to the gig and meet you guys there. I'll go off by myself and create and write all these books and write all these lyrics. So this hidden power with the Sun, the 12th Lord on the 12th, I think also really bodes well for Virgo. So this is why once I started looking at the chart from here, it makes a lot of sense. The timing also really makes sense. So if we go here, he would have joined Rush at this time in Jupiter Rahu, right on the cusp of the Saturn Dasha. Now, especially Rahu makes a lot of sense here. Now, I don't have the harmonic charts rectified. I kind of put it here, but this is the D10, the D9. So I don't feel confident really rectifying the harmonic charts, but it's somewhere around here, I'm pretty sure, because the karmas really line up. This is when he would have joined Rush. Jupiter Rahu, right on the verge of Saturn. And this is when his whole life would have changed, right on the verge of this Raja Yoga Saturn. This first part, when he was in Rush, this was the first couple albums. By the time the end of 1976 hit, this was when they really got their independence. After they wrote 2112, this was when Rush really became a fixture, when his Saturn Dasha would have started and that Raja Yoga planet in the first, that Raja Yoga would have kicked in. Before that, even Rush, even the band was still kind of tenuous. He joined and then they toured, and then they did a second album, Fly By Night, then third album, Caress of Steel, and then they reached a kind of crossroads where they almost, sort of fell apart because of the record companies leaning on them to do things that are more commercial. And they were like, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to do what we want. And it was a huge success. And that happened in Saturn Dasha. So by the time Saturn Dasha started, they would have been successful. And then their success really, this is some of their biggest success. Saturn, Mercury especially. This was some of the huge success right here. Saturn, Mercury. And again, this makes a lot of sense because Mercury is the ruling planet. So Saturn, Mercury. Saturn is also ruling Rahu in the 5th. Right? And Mercury is the ruling planet and the 10th Lord of Fame. So this was really when they exploded from the end of, it was maybe 78, but 79, this was when they made moving picture. I mean, they made permanent waves. And then by the time they got into Saturn Ketu, which would have been in 1982, this period of time here encapsulates permanent waves, moving pictures, those two really transformative albums. And then Saturn Ketu, this would have been into Signals and then Grace Under Pressure albums. But especially this period of time right here, this was when Rush really exploded. And you see these powerful yogas here with Saturn in his first house and then Saturn Mercury, the second dasha, like bam, this is when they became sort of transformative figures. And this was when their fame became so much and made them then write songs like Limelight. Again, Saturn Mercury, he'd have been in Saturn Mercury dasha when he started to feel uncomfortable with all that fame as well. And like I said, feeling uncomfortable with the fame is showing this Mercury in the 12th house saying, I just want to escape from all that stuff. I like the benefit. I like getting out there doing my thing. I love getting out there playing and communicating, but I'm uncomfortable with all this fame stuff, right? So you really can see that. And now to get into some of the sad stuff, in 1997 and 98 is when his daughter died and his wife died, right when Mercury dasha would have started. You can see these big shifts. This is why the dashas are so powerful in Vedic astrology, because you see these big shifts happen when big things happen. Goes into Mercury dasha. It was 1997 that his daughter was killed in a car accident, and then 98 his wife. So this would have been in the Mercury dasha. And again, Mercury is the ruler of these planets here in the first, and Mercury is in the 12th. He's widely combust. I wouldn't really consider it combustion. But Mercury also rules Mars in the 3rd, especially Mars is a double Marika here. I mean, Mars is a double indicator of death. There's a lot of Marika energy here, which I'll explain in a minute. But Mars is the 8th Lord and the 3rd Lord for Virgo. And if you've not researched death in astrology is that much, I'll tell you, 8th house is definitely death, the 8th Lord. Saturn is also death. And the 3rd Lord, because it's the 8th from the 8th, and anything in the 3rd. 3rd, 8th, and Saturn are the real karakas. And then you also have Marika planets, the 2nd and 7th lords. But definitely any planet that's a double Marika, which rules the 3rd and the 8th houses, that's Mars for Virgo and Venus for Pisces, become this double 8th lord, 3rd and 8th lord. And Mercury rules it because it's in Jeshta Nakshatra. So Mercury has a lot of Marika qualities, or what are called killer qualities. He rules the 3rd and 8th lord here from Virgo. He also rules Saturn, which is the karaka of death. He also rules Venus, which is a Marika, the 2nd lord, but that's sort of tertiary. But more importantly, Mercury is in the 12th as well, which shows loss, which shows that the dasha of Mercury is going to be where there's enormous loss and then isolation and sorrow and having to regenerate yourself. And that's exactly what happened. What his Mercury dasha did is after his wife and daughter died, what he did is he got on a motorcycle and by himself and just drove all over the place for a few years. He was the first several sections up until from this 98 through 99, early 2000, a couple years, during this Mercury K2, Mercury Venus especially, he just got on his motorcycle and drove all over the place. He drove from Alaska down the U.S. coast into South America. He drove, I don't know how many miles, but all over the U.S. and Canada. They're from Canada, but also South America, Mexico, all over the place on his motorcycle by himself. So what Mercury was really about was this isolation and finding himself. So again, this is very much Mercury as the Lagna Lord, as the ruling planet. Also the ruler of the moon. So everything was shaken to the core in Mercury Dasha. And again, Mercury is also ruling this debilitated Venus. Venus is debilitated. His wife dies. His child dies. Look, Saturn is the fifth lord, his child. Venus is the Karaka of partner, his wife. They both died suddenly at the beginning of that dasha, and sent him on a trip to find himself in isolation, where he's riding around all over the place on a motorcycle by himself. And again, this puts Mercury in the 12th house with the sun in the 12th, which is the ruler of the 12th. Both self-indicators, Mercury, the ruling planet, and the sun, the natural Atma Karaka, or the natural soul indicator, in the 12th house of isolation and solitude. But he wasn't just by himself. He was by himself riding on a motorcycle and stopping in cafes along the way, writing stuff like travelogue. That's what he did to deal with his wife's death, and drove all over the place, his daughter and his wife's death. And you know what he said was that it was such an education, he said, because when you lose something like that and you're so shaken, the way he explained it was, he said, it's like my little baby heart needed movement. It's like when you rock a baby, or you take the baby for a drive. You know, like when you rock the baby, the heart gets soothed. And he said, my baby heart was just so hurt. I didn't know how to calm it down. So all the movement, just the constant movement on the motorcycle, especially in the midst of these mountains and all of these things that have been there for millions and millions of years, seeing the sky and the mountains and all this landscape, you feel your life in more perspective. And again, you can see Mercury is also the ruler of his moon. And look, his moon is in Ardra nakshatra. Ardra is the nakshatra of tears, a flood of tears. This is where Shiva cries tears because of his wife who died. Makes a lot of sense. Not only his wife died, his daughter died at that time. It was in Mercury that his daughter died, and then in Mercury Ketu that his wife died. We see Ketu is in Aslesha nakshatra here. Again, so that was a very sad period. And then they came back. They had a great comeback around this time. Mercury Moon, Mercury Mars, and you know, they started, you know, doing albums again, had some great success. Some sort of a kind of regenerative success came in this Ketu Dasha. They started to become sort of popular again. Particularly, you know, there was a movie called I Love You Man. There was, you know, they were portrayed in some other cartoons and other stuff that I don't watch. I don't watch TV, but they achieved another kind of popularity in his Ketu Dasha, and you know, they kept touring and doing other things, and then their last tour ended up right around this time. Ketu Mars, probably Ketu Rahu, probably Ketu Jupiter. This has been around the time that he started to get the tumor, the glioblastoma, 2015 to 2016. And then this would have shown that he just went into Venus Dasha when he passed. And so he would have just started Venus Dasha. And, you know, again, Venus is debilitated. It's the second lord, which is a Marika planet. Oh yeah, this is the big thing here, as Venus rules Mercury and Sun in the 12th house in Purva Falguni Nakshatra. So he was hanging on. He fought the glioblastoma off during this whole time. Usually those things take you in they can take you in a few months. It's the most aggressive brain cancer, the glioblastoma. He hung on for 3 years with that glioblastoma. He probably wanted to see his daughter grow up. Ugh. But he held on for 3 years. But then the Venus dasha started, and it was time. And this Venus dasha, it rules these planets in the 12th house, which is about letting go and surrender. I think eventually he just let go. He's like, okay, I'm at peace with this. I can let go now. I think he was at peace. I think we can all rest easy. He held on, and then finally he let go. He said, okay, I'm at peace. This Ketu in Pisces in his Navamsha shows the liberated soul. And ruling Mercury, Sun in the 12th house, those two self factors, I think he just surrendered and he was taken. It was like, okay, all right. And his loved ones were around him, and they said, we're okay. We're okay. You can go. And he let go. Amazing, amazing man. Never see another one like him. You'll never see those kind of lyrics again. You'll never see that kind of drummer again. You'll definitely never see the two combined in the same person. It's an era that's gone, but also just the quality, the craftsmanship, the integrity. Those guys wrote the music they wanted to write. They could have been sellouts. They could have done everything else that the music industry wants people to do. In an industry that has almost no integrity, there's some integrity, but even personal flaws and personal characteristics, and again, partying and drinking and drugs and things where you wouldn't be like, kind of an idiot. The thing that people love about Rush was, it's nice to see good guys doing great stuff and being good guys and being smart and dedicated and with integrity for decades and decades. These guys were still playing some of the most complicated music ever put together when they were in their 60s. It's remarkable. I mean, these guys are playing that stuff better than they were when they were in their 20s. I mean, anyway, so I could just go on and keep geeking out about Rush and how amazing they were. But I wanted to do this case study because Neil Peart was such a legend. And for those of you who do understand astrology and are a Rush fan, or even if you're one or the other, maybe you got something out of it, even if you're one of my many musician friends, maybe you got a little bit out of hearing me talk about the astrology, even though you might not understand the reason I'm saying it astrologically. Hearing me put it that way and describe, the thoroughness or the seriousness or whatever was interesting. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this, and leave me some comments and questions and share it with some